Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a saying that echoes across the corridors of power in the Imperium of man, whispered in the shadows of hive cities, and muttered in the quiet chambers of planetary governors. It goes something like this. Nobody expects the Inquisition. And in a galaxy of 10,000 years of war, of horrors so vast that the human mind can barely comprehend them, that saying holds more truth than most people would ever want to acknowledge. Because the Inquisition does not announce itself with trumpets and banners. It does not march across open fields in gleaming armor for all to see. It arrives in silence, in the dead of night, in the form of a single figure with cold eyes and an iron seal pressed against their chest. And when the Inquisition arrives, worlds tremble. Welcome, friends, to what is going to be a long, comfortable, and deeply immersive journey into one of the most fascinating, terrifying, and morally complicated organizations in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. We are going to talk about the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, the secret police of the Imperium, the Watchers in the Dark, the ones who carry the authority of the Emperor himself, and who wield that authority with a hand that can be as gentle as a surgeon's scalpel, or as devastating as an orbital bombardment that scours all life from an entire world. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. Because this is not a topic you can rush through. The Inquisition is one of those subjects in the law that goes deep, far deeper than most people realize. When you first encounter the Inquisition in 40k, you might think of them as simply the guys who hunt heretics, and that is true, and in the broadest sense. But the reality is so much more nuanced, so much more layered, so much more human in its contradictions and its darkness, that once you start pulling at the threads, you find yourself lost in a web of political intrigue, philosophical debate, ancient secrets, and moral dilemmas that have no clean answers. We are going to start at the very beginning, back in the final desperate hours of the Horus Heresy, when the galaxy was burning and everything the Emperor had built teetered on the edge of annihilation. We will follow the Inquisition through 10,000 years of history, through its founding, its evolution, its divisions, and its wars. We will meet the men and women who carry the inquisitorial seal, who walk between the light and the darkness, who sometimes become the very thing they were created to destroy. We will explore the three great orders, the secret chambers militant that serve them, the philosophical divide between Puritans and radicals that tears the organization apart from within, and the famous inquisitors, whose names have become legend across the galaxy. And through all of it, we will try to understand a fundamental question that lies at the heart of everything the Inquisition does. How far is too far? What price is acceptable to pay for the survival of the human race? And what happens when the people you trust to guard you from the darkness start to become part of it? Let us begin. Picture, if you will, the Imperium of man, not as a map or a political entity, but as a living, breathing thing, a civilization that stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, that encompasses trillions upon trillions of human souls. That has endured for 10,000 years against threats so terrible that most of its citizens are not even permitted to know they exist. From the towering hive cities of worlds like Necromunda, where billions of workers toil in factories that churn out munitions day and night, to the agri-worlds that feed entire sectors with their endless fields of grain, to the fortress worlds that stand as bulwarks against the darkness of the void, the Imperium is vast beyond comprehension. It is the greatest empire that humanity has ever known, and it is rotting from within, because for all its size, for all its power, for all its legions of soldiers and its fleets of warships, and its chapters of superhuman warriors clad in power armor, the Imperium is besieged. On every front, on every world, in every shadowed corner of its vast domain, our enemies press inward. The forces of chaos whisper through the warp, corrupting the faithful and turning brother against brother. Alien civilizations, from the ravening swarms of the Tyranids to the cunning machinations of the Eldari, to the brutal green tide of the orcs, assail its borders without rest. And from within, heresies bloom like poisoned flowers. Cults spring up in the underhives of 1,000 worlds, and the ever-growing population of unsanctioned psychers threatens to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. This is the galaxy in which the Inquisition operates. This is the world they were created to protect. And make no mistake, without them, without the shadowy figures who prowl the corridors of power and the streets of the underhive alike, the Imperium would have fallen long ago. Not to any single great threat, but to the slow, grinding accumulation of a million small ones, each one gnawing away at the foundations of human civilization, like termites in the walls of a great cathedral. The Inquisition exists outside the normal hierarchy of the Imperium. It answers to no governor, no general, no lord or lady of any imperial organization. In theory, its agents answer only to the Emperor himself. And since the Emperor has been silent upon the Golden Throne for 10 millennia, that effectively means they answer to no one at all. An Inquisitor carries with them an authority that is, in principle, absolute. They can commandeer ships, requisition armies, demand the assistance of Space Marine chapters, and override the orders of planetary governors. They can condemn a man to death with a word, or condemn an entire world to oblivion with a single command. Yes, they are judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. And yet, for all this power, for all this authority, the Inquisition is not a monolithic force. It is not a single, unified organization with a clear chain of command and a set of standardized operating procedures. Far from it. The Inquisition is, in many ways, as fractured and divided as the galaxy it seeks to protect. Its members disagree violently on methodology, on philosophy, on the very definition of what constitutes a threat to the Imperium. They spy on each other, plot against each other, and in some cases, openly wage war against each other. The Inquisition polices the Imperium, but who polices the Inquisition? The answer, uncomfortably, is the Inquisition itself. And the results of that arrangement are exactly as messy and contradictory as you might expect. But before we can understand what the Inquisition has become, we need to understand where it came from. And for that, we need to go back, far back, to the darkest hour in the history of humanity, when the dreams of a golden age were shattered by betrayal, and the Emperor of mankind gave the order that would echo through the next 10,000 years. Let us go back to the Horus Heresy, the seeds of the Inquisition, Malcador, and the Emperor's last command. The year was approximately 14 of the 31st millennium, and the galaxy was on fire. The Horus Heresy, the single greatest catastrophe in the history of the human species, was tearing the Imperium apart. Fully half of the Emperor's 20 Space Marine legions had turned traitor under the influence of the Warmaster Horus. Yes, and the forces of chaos were pouring through the cracks in reality like floodwater through a broken dam. The Great Crusade, that magnificent endeavor to reunite the scattered worlds of humanity under a single banner, was over. What had taken centuries to build was being destroyed in a matter of years. On Terra, the Emperor of mankind knew that the situation was dire beyond measure. He was fighting a war on two fronts, struggling to hold the Imperial webway closed against the demonic incursion that Magnus the Red's catastrophic psychic message had unleashed, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable assault on Terra itself. He could feel the darkness closing in, could sense the hand of the Chaos Gods reaching through the warp to claim everything he had built. And in those desperate hours, yet he turned to the one man he trusted above all others. Not a primarch, not a general, not a warrior, but an old man, frail of body but immense of spirit, whose loyalty had been proven over millennia of service. Malcador, the Sigillite. Now, Malcador is one of those figures in the lore who does not get nearly enough attention, and that is partly by design. He was never meant to be a figure of legend. He was meant to be the man behind the throne, the administrator, the advisor, the quiet hand that guided the Imperium while the Emperor fought his wars and the Primarchs led their legions. But Malcador was so much more than that. He was, by some accounts, nearly 7,000 years old by the time of the heresy, an ancient being of immense psychic power, who may have been what is known as a perpetual, a being functionally immune to death. He was a member of an ancient order called the Sigillites, dedicated to preserving the greatest artifacts and knowledge of humanity. And he had been at the Emperor's side since before the Unification Wars, since the days when the Emperor was merely one warlord among many on the ravaged surface of old Earth. It was Malcador who had suggested the Emperor take the title Emperor in the first place. It was Malcador who had founded the Administratum, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that kept the Imperium running. It was Malcador who served as Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, directing the deadliest killers in the galaxy against the Emperor's most dangerous enemies. And when the Horus heresy erupted, when everything began to fall apart, well, it was Malcador who the Emperor turned to with a command that would shape the future of the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor told Malcador to seek out individuals of exceptional character, skill, and determination. Men and women who could be tested, trained, and forged into something new. An elite group of investigators who would serve as humanity's shield against the threats that lurked in the shadows. Threats from within, from without, and from beyond the veil of reality itself. The Emperor understood, even then, that the galaxy was full of dangers that could not be fought with bolter and blade alone. There were enemies that worked through subtlety and corruption, through whispered promises and hidden cults, through the slow erosion of faith and the quiet turning of loyal hearts to treason. And against such enemies, yes, the Imperium needed something different, something that could operate outside the normal chains of command, that could go anywhere, investigate anything, and act with the full authority of the Emperor himself. This was the seed from which the Inquisition would grow. Malcador moved quickly. Among the very first individuals he approached for this sacred duty were two space marines whose names would become legendary in the annals of Imperial history. The first was Nathaniel Garrow, a captain of the Death Guard Legion. Now think about that for a moment. The Death Guard was one of the traitor legions, one of the 9 that had followed Horus into damnation. But Garrow had remained loyal. He had been aboard the Imperial frigate Eisenstein when the terrible truth of Horus's betrayal was first revealed. And he had risked everything to bring word of the treachery back to Terra. Garrow was a man who had watched his own legion turn against everything it had sworn to protect, who had seen brothers he had fought beside for centuries transformed into monsters by the touch of chaos, and who had emerged from that crucible with his faith and his loyalty intact. The second was Yacton Cruz, a former captain of the Sons of Horus. Think about that one even harder. Cruz had been a member of Horus's own legion, the legion that bore the War Master's name, and he had chosen the Emperor over his own Primarch. If you want to understand the kind of people Malcador was looking for, these two are your template. Not the strongest warriors, not the most skilled tacticians, but individuals of unbreakable moral character, when people who could stare into the abyss of betrayal and corruption and refuse to blink. Malcador tasked Garrow with a mission of extraordinary importance. He was to travel across the galaxy, even into the territories controlled by the traitor legions, and seek out other space marines of similar character, warriors who had remained loyal to the Emperor despite the corruption that had consumed their brothers. These individuals would become known as the Knights Errant, and they would serve as Malcador's personal agents in what he called the Silent War, a covert conflict fought in the shadows while the great battles of the heresy raged across the stars. The Knights Errant wore plain grey armor, stripped of all legion markings and heraldry. In place of their former insignia, they bore the personal sigil of Malcador the Sigillite, a stylized letter I, with 3 horizontal lines through its center. If that symbol sounds familiar, it should, because that same symbol, that same stylized I, would one day become the most feared icon in the galaxy. It would become the inquisitorial seal, the rosette that every inquisitor carries as their badge of office, the symbol that grants its bearer authority over all the institutions of the Imperium. When you see an Inquisitor flash their rosette and watch a planetary governor's face drain of color, remember that the origin of that symbol was a frail old man and a handful of loyal warriors fighting a desperate secret war in the shadows of the worst catastrophe humanity had ever known. Cruz, meanwhile, was kept closer to Terra, serving as Malcador's hand in investigative matters. While he was the first of what we might recognize as an inquisitorial investigator, a man whose job was not to fight on the front lines but to root out hidden treachery, to identify the signs of corruption before they could metastasize into something catastrophic. In many ways, Cruz was the prototype for every Inquisitor who would come after him. A solitary agent operating in the shadows, armed with authority and determination, hunting enemies that wore the faces of friends. As the heresy ground on and the situation grew ever more desperate, Malcador's project expanded. He gathered not just Space Marines, but mortal men and women as well. Lords, administrators, scholars, individuals from all walks of life who possessed the qualities he was looking for, that combination of intelligence, determination, moral strength, and the willingness to make terrible choices in service of a greater good. These people came from different backgrounds, different worlds, different traditions, but they all shared one thing in common. They were willing to sacrifice everything, including their own souls, for the survival of the human race. And then came the final hours. The siege of Terra was reaching its climax. Horus's forces had broken through the outer defenses, and the traitor legions were fighting their way toward the imperial palace itself. The Emperor knew that he had to confront Horus personally, that only by facing the War Master aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, could the heresy be ended. But to do that, he needed to leave the Golden Throne, the great psychic device that was holding the breach in the webway, closed against the demonic flood. Someone had to take his place on the throne, someone with enough psychic power to maintain the wards, at least for a time. The Emperor's original choice for this task had been the Primarch Magnus the Red, the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs. But Magnus had sided with Horus, corrupted by the very powers he had once studied, and so the duty fell to Malcador. The Sigillite knew what this meant. He was a powerful psyker, perhaps the second most powerful human psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor himself, but he was nothing compared to his master. Sitting on the Golden Throne would destroy him. It was not a question of if, but of when, and he accepted this fate without hesitation. But before Malcador ascended to the throne, he had one final duty to perform. He appeared before the Emperor, accompanied by 12 hooded figures. The Emperor surveyed them in stern silence and saw that his faithful servant had done well. Of the 12, 4 were mortal lords and administrators of the Imperium, individuals possessed of inquisitive minds and unyielding mental fortitude. The other 8 were Space Marines, many of them drawn from the Knights Errant, warriors whose abilities were matched only by their dedication to the Emperor's cause. Some of these Space Marines had come from legions that had turned traitor, but these individuals had never wavered in their loyalty. They had fought the heresy from within, risking everything to remain true to their oaths. The Emperor approved of Malcador's selections, and with that approval, the future of the Imperium was shaped in ways that would echo across 10,000 years. The 8 Space Marines who possessed psychic abilities were given a special mission. They would travel to Titan, the largest moon of the gas giant Saturn in the Sol system, where Malcador had prepared a hidden fortress monastery. Using his immense psychic powers, Malcador cast what may have been the greatest enchantment of his entire life. He hid Titan in the warp itself, shrouding it behind macrogeller fields and sigillic rites that would protect it from the energies of chaos, while the final battles of the heresy played out in real space. On Titan, those 8 Space Marines would train recruits and build something new, a chapter of Space Marines unlike any other. Warriors who would be dedicated entirely to the destruction of demons, or who would possess the knowledge and the tools to fight the most terrifying enemies that chaos could produce. When Titan eventually re-emerged from the warp after the heresy's end, it did not return with 8 space marines and a handful of raw recruits. Time had passed differently within the warp, flowing faster within that protected sanctuary, and what emerged was a full chapter of 1,000 fully trained battle brothers. They were given the designation Chapter 666, and they would come to be known by a name that would strike fear into the hearts of demons across the galaxy: the Grey Knights. But we will return to them later. For now, let us focus on the other half of Malcador's legacy, the 4 mortal individuals, and the broader network of agents and investigators he had assembled. Because these people, and these ordinary human beings armed with nothing but their wits, their authority, and their unbreakable determination, were the ones who would become the Inquisition. The first years, an organization born in fire. Malcador, the Sigillite, did not survive the Siege of Terror. He took the Emperor's place upon the Golden Throne, and the immense psychic strain of maintaining the wards against the warp burned through him like fire through parchment. When the Emperor was returned to the throne after his battle with Horus, mortally wounded and barely clinging to life, Malcador was little more than a withered husk. His last act was to give up the final reserves of his strength to sustain the Emperor long enough for him to give his final orders to his remaining sons. Now, the Emperor declared that Malcador the Sigillite would henceforth be known as Malcador the Hero, a title that would endure for as long as the Imperium itself. But even in death, Malcador's work lived on. The individuals he had gathered, the network of agents he had built, the structures he had put in place, all of these continued to function even after the Sigillite himself was gone. And in the chaotic aftermath of the heresy, as the shattered Imperium struggled to rebuild itself, these individuals stepped forward to claim their role. Now, the exact details of what happened next are the subject of considerable debate and deliberate obfuscation within the lore. The Inquisition has always been an organization that guards its own secrets with fanatical dedication, and the story of its founding is no exception. Well, there are at least 2 different accounts of how the Inquisition came to be formally established, and it is entirely possible that both contain elements of truth while neither tells the complete story. The first account is the one we have already discussed, the story of Malcador's 12, the individuals who were presented to the Emperor in the final hours of the siege and who went on to form the nucleus of the new organization. According to this version of events, the 4 mortal lords among the 12 took on the task of building the Inquisition's organizational structure, while the 8 Space Marines traveled to Titan to become the Grey Knights. This version of events is broadly supported by the Horus Heresy novels and is generally considered the most widely accepted account. The second account is stranger and more mysterious. According to this version, the original founders of the Inquisition were 4 individuals who had emerged from the heresy with deeply conflicting views about the Emperor's fate and the future of the Imperium. 2 of them, known as Prometheus and Moriana, believed that the Emperor could and should be restored to life, that his interment on the Golden Throne was not the end, but merely a temporary setback that could be overcome. The other 2 believed that this was folly, that what had happened, and that the Imperium must move forward under the new reality of an emperor who could no longer walk among his people. Prometheus and Moriana, the resurrectionists, left Terra to begin their quest to find a way to bring the Emperor back. But at some point, their paths diverged. Moriana began to look toward the dark powers, toward the very forces of chaos that had caused the heresy in the first place, believing that the power of the warp could be harnessed to achieve the resurrection. This was too much for Prometheus, who banished Moriana for her dangerous beliefs. The disciples of Prometheus, known as the Promeans, would continue their quest to restore the Emperor across many centuries, eventually evolving into what would become known as the Thorian philosophy within the Inquisition. The 2 founders who remained on Terra acted quickly to establish themselves within the newly forming power structures of the post-heresy Imperium. They integrated themselves into the Senatorum Imperialis, the governing council of the High Lords of Terror, and created an organization whose purpose was twofold. First, to combat the threats of chaos, aliens, and an internal corruption that endangered the Imperium. And second, to counter the potentially dangerous efforts of Promeus and Moriana, whose quest to resurrect the Emperor could easily go catastrophically wrong. Whether these two accounts are contradictory or complementary is something that even the lore does not make entirely clear. It is possible that the 4 founders of the second account were among Malcador's 12, and that the disagreement between the resurrectionists and the pragmatists was an early schism within the newly formed organization. What we do know is that on the first anniversary of the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, when the Senatorum Imperialis convened for a solemn ceremony of remembrance, and a grim-faced man joined the council and identified himself as a representative of the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition. Note the plural. Orders, not order. The use of the plural suggests that even at this early stage, the Inquisition was not a single monolithic entity, but an amalgamation of several different groups, each with their own focus and their own methodology. This is important because it sets the pattern for everything that would follow. The Inquisition has never been unified. It has always been a coalition, a loose confederation of individuals and groups bound together by a common purpose, but divided by their approaches to fulfilling it. In these earliest days, the Inquisition was small, secretive, and largely unknown. Its agents operated from the shadows, investigating threats that most of the Imperium's population did not even know existed. The general public had never heard of the Inquisition, and even within the upper echelons of imperial power, knowledge of the organization was limited to the most senior officials. This was by design. The Inquisition's power lay not in overt force, but in the ability to go where it pleased, to investigate whom it chose, and to act without the constraints of bureaucracy or political interference. The newly formed Inquisition inherited Malcador's original mandate to seek out and destroy the enemies of humanity wherever they lurked. But the scope of that mandate was breathtakingly broad. Chaos cultists, alien infiltrators, unsanctioned psychers, treacherous officials, mutant uprisings. The list of potential threats was essentially endless. And the galaxy was a big place. Even with the authority of the Emperor behind them, the early Inquisitors were a handful of individuals trying to police a civilization that spanned 1,000,000 worlds. They made do. They recruited agents. They built networks of informants. They cultivated contacts within every branch of the imperial government, from the administratum to the ecclesiarchy to the astra militarum. They learned to operate in the spaces between the great institutions of the Imperium, using the gaps in the bureaucracy and the tensions between competing power centers to their advantage. And slowly, over decades and centuries, the Inquisition grew. Not into a vast organization with a clear hierarchy and standardized procedures, because that was never the intention, but into something more subtle and, in many ways, more powerful. A network of individuals, each one operating with considerable autonomy, each one pursuing their own investigations and building their own power bases, but all connected by a shared purpose and a shared authority. In these early centuries, the Inquisition operated as essentially a single order, based primarily around the moon of Titan, the same fortress that housed the Grey Knights. The Inquisitors, who had emerged from Malcador's original mandate, were, for the most part, focused on the threat of chaos, which had, after all, been the driving force behind the heresy that had necessitated the Inquisition's creation in the first place. Demons, chaos cults, the lingering corruption left behind by the traitor legions, these were the primary targets of the early Inquisition. But the galaxy was changing. New threats were emerging, and the Inquisition would have to change with it. The War of the Beast and the First Great Division. For roughly 1,500 years after its founding, the Inquisition operated as a largely unified organization. Its agents were generalists, capable of investigating any type of threat, And the demon-hunting mandate that had been its original purpose was the common thread that bound them all together. The Grey Knights, hidden on Titan, served as the Inquisition's ultimate weapon against the forces of chaos, deployed only when a demonic threat had grown beyond the ability of ordinary Imperial forces to contain. But this arrangement was about to be tested in a way that no one had anticipated. In the middle of the 32nd millennium, approximately 1500 years after the end of the Horus heresy, the Imperium faced a crisis unlike anything it had experienced since the heresy itself. The Orcs, those green-skinned brutes who had been a persistent nuisance throughout the Great Crusade and beyond, suddenly coalesced into something far more dangerous than any previous greenskin force. Under the leadership of a being known simply as the Beast, the Orcs launched an invasion of such scale and ferocity that it threatened to overwhelm the Imperium entirely. Now, to understand how terrifying this was, you need to understand the Orcs. They are often treated as comic relief in the lore, the funny green guys who love nothing more than a good scrap. But there is nothing funny about a full-scale Orc offensive. The Orcs are a species that gets bigger and stronger the more they fight. A species that reproduces through spores released from their bodies. A species whose technology, while crude in appearance, is powered by a collective psychic field so powerful that their machines work simply because enough Orcs believe they should. And when the Orcs unite under a sufficiently powerful leader, when they stop fighting each other and turn their collective fury outward, the result is a green tide that can swallow entire sectors of space. The Beast was the most powerful Orc warlord to arise since, well, possibly ever. His forces were organized, disciplined, and equipped with technology that rivaled anything the Imperium could field. They built attack moons, planetoid-sized fortresses that could devastate entire systems. They had diplomats and ambassadors. Think about that. Orcs with ambassadors. The Beast was not just a mindless brute. He was a strategic genius, a being of terrifying intelligence and cunning, and his invasion brought the Imperium to its knees. Terror itself was threatened. The Orcs came so close to the heart of the Imperium that panic spread through the Senatorum Imperialis. The High Lords of Terror, those 12 individuals who nominally governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name, were paralyzed by indecision and internal squabbling. It was one of the darkest hours the Imperium had faced since the Siege of Terror, and for a time, it seemed as though the entire edifice of imperial civilization might crumble. During this crisis, the Inquisition was forced to step out of the shadows in ways it never had before. Inquisitorial representative Vinand, who served as the Inquisition's voice on the Senatorum Imperialis, found herself at the center of the political maelstrom. She was a woman of formidable intellect and iron will, and she understood that the crisis demanded more than business as usual. The existing structure of the Inquisition, a single, largely homogeneous organization focused primarily on chaos, was not equipped to deal with the magnitude and variety of threats that the Imperium now faced. Wynand pushed for a fundamental restructuring of the Inquisition. The alien threat posed by the Orcs, and by the many other Xeno species that pressed against the Imperium's borders, required specialized attention. The demonic threat of chaos was not going away, but it could no longer be the Inquisition's sole focus. The Imperium needed dedicated specialists, and agents who would devote their careers to understanding and combating specific categories of threat. And so, in the wake of the War of the Beast, the Inquisition was formally divided into two great orders for the first time. The first was the Ordo Malleus, which continued the Inquisition's original mandate of combating the forces of chaos. The name means Order of the Hammer in High Gothic, and it was a fitting designation for an organization dedicated to smashing the demonic wherever it manifested. The Ordo Malleus inherited the Grey Knights as its chamber militant, its dedicated military force, and it continued to operate from the fortress on Titan. The second was the Ordo Xenos, the alien hunters, dedicated to protecting the Imperium from the myriad alien threats that lurked beyond its borders, and, increasingly, within them as well. The Ordo Xenos was born directly from the lessons of the War of the Beast. from the realization that the Imperium could not afford to be caught off guard by a Xenos threat of that magnitude ever again. The creation of the Ordo Xenos also led to the establishment of its own Chamber Militant. The Death Watch was formed from the survivors of the various Space Marine chapters that had fought in the invasion of the Beast's capital world of Olanor Prime. These chapters had suffered devastating losses, and the survivors stood vigil over their fallen brothers, united by shared grief and shared purpose. Lord Commander Corland, the last surviving member of the Imperial Fists chapter and the hero of the War of the Beast, worked with Vinand to formalize this arrangement. The Death Watch would be a unique chapter. It's composed not of warriors from a single gene line, but of veteran space marines drawn from chapters all across the Imperium. They would serve the Ordo Xenos as the Grey Knights served the Ordo Malleus, providing the military muscle needed to deal with Xenos threats too dangerous for ordinary Imperial forces. This division was not without controversy. Some within the Inquisition feared that splitting the organization would weaken it, that specialization would lead to tunnel vision, and that Inquisitors focused on one type of threat might miss the connections between different categories of danger. Chaos and Xenos influence, after all, were not always separate problems. A Genestealer cult could pave the way for a Tyranid invasion, which could in turn create the kind of societal upheaval that Chaos cults thrived on. The threats facing the Imperium were interconnected, and dividing the Inquisition into separate orders risked creating artificial boundaries between investigators who needed to work together. But the pragmatists won the argument. The galaxy was simply too vast, and the threats too varied, for a single, undifferentiated organization to handle effectively. Specialization was necessary, even if it came with risks. And so the Inquisition entered a new phase of its existence, one that would set the pattern for the organization it would become over the next 8,000 years. The division between the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Xenos also formalized a principle that had always existed within the Inquisition, but had never been explicitly stated. Membership in an ordo was not absolute, while an Inquisitor was free to move between the ordos as their interests and investigations demanded. An ordo was not a rigid hierarchy but more of a professional association, a grouping of like-minded individuals who shared a common focus. An Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, who stumbled upon evidence of chaos corruption during an alien investigation, was not forbidden from pursuing that lead. They were simply expected to coordinate with their colleagues in the Ordo Malleus if the situation warranted it. This flexibility was intentional. The founders of the divided Inquisition understood that the threats facing the Imperium did not respect bureaucratic boundaries. They designed the ordos to be permeable, to encourage collaboration rather than competition, and to create specialists who could work together, rather than isolated fiefdoms that jealously guarded their territory. Whether this ideal was ever fully realized in practice is another question entirely, but the intention was sound. With the War of the Beast concluded and the Inquisition divided into its first two ordos, the Imperium entered a period of relative stability, at least by its own grim standards. The centuries rolled by, new threats arose and were dealt with, and the Inquisition continued to grow in both size and influence. But the organization's next great transformation was still centuries away, waiting for a crisis that would come not from outside the Imperium, but from within its very heart. And that crisis would be called the Age of Apostasy. The Age of Apostasy and the birth of the Ordo. Hereticus. The 36th millennium brought the Imperium to its knees in a way that was, in many respects, even more disturbing than the Horus Heresy or the War of the Beast.
Now, real quick before we keep going, I just want to say this is honestly one of my favorite topics in all of 40k. The Inquisition is what got me hooked on this universe in the first place. There's something about these lone agents carrying the weight of entire worlds on their shoulders that just hits different. They're not superhuman like Space Marines. They're not immortal like the Custodes. They're just people, flawed, stubborn, sometimes brilliant, sometimes terrible, making impossible calls with no safety net. And I think that's what makes them so and I think that's what makes them so compelling. You can actually see yourself in their shoes, and that's terrifying, because you can start asking yourself, what would you do with that kind of power? Would you stay clean? Would you cross the line? Honestly, I don't know. And I think that uncertainty is the whole point. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Because this time, the enemy was not a corrupted Primarch or an alien warlord. The enemy was a human being, an ambitious, ruthless, and utterly power-hungry man who rose through the ranks of the Imperium's own bureaucracy to claim an authority that rivaled the Emperor's own. His name was Goja Vandyra. Vandyra was the master of the Administratum, one of the most powerful positions in the Imperium's civilian government. The Administratum was the vast bureaucratic machine that kept the Imperium running, processing the endless paperwork and logistical calculations that allowed a civilization spanning 1,000,000 worlds to function. Whilst it was not a glamorous role, but it was an enormously powerful one, because whoever controlled the Administratum controlled the flow of information, resources, and personnel throughout the entire Imperium. Vandyra was not content with this considerable power. Through a combination of political maneuvering, intimidation, and outright violence, he managed to claim the position of ecclesiarch as well, the head of the Adeptus Ministorum, the imperial church. With one hand, he controlled the Imperium's bureaucracy, with the other, he controlled its religion. And since the ecclesiarchy commanded the faith and devotion of trillions of imperial citizens, this gave Vandyra a power base that was virtually unassailable. What followed was a period known as the Reign of Blood, and the name was not hyperbolic. Vandyra's rule was characterized by tyranny, paranoia, and violence on a staggering scale. He had dissenters executed by the thousands. He redirected the Imperium's military resources to serve his personal ambitions, rather than defend against external threats. He surrounded himself with a personal bodyguard of fanatically loyal warrior women called the Daughters of the Emperor, later known as the Brides of the Emperor, whom he had convinced through a combination of manipulation and a staged miracle that he was a living saint, a vessel of the Emperor's divine will. For almost a century, Vandyra held the Imperium in his iron grip. The High Lords of Terror were either cowed or replaced by his loyalists. The Astra Militarum was fragmented and demoralized. The Space Marine chapters, bound by their own codes of independence, were reluctant to intervene in what they saw as a political matter. And the Inquisition, that supposedly all-powerful organization with the authority to override any imperial official, found itself hamstrung by the sheer scope of Vandyra's power and the difficulty of acting against a man who had effectively made himself the voice of the imperial creed. It took a man named Sebastian Thor, a humble preacher from a backwater world, to rally the opposition and bring Vandyra's reign to an end. Thor was, by all accounts, a genuinely good man, a man of authentic faith whose sermons drew followers by the millions. He led a great crusade against Vandyra, a campaign that eventually reached the gates of the imperial palace itself. In the end, it was Vandyra's own bodyguards who ended his reign. The Daughters of the Emperor, one confronted with proof of Vandyra's corruption by the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own personal guard, turned against their master and struck him down. The aftermath of the Age of Apostasy was a period of massive reform. Sebastian Thor became the new ecclesiarch and immediately set about dismantling the power structures that had allowed Vandyra to rise. One of the most important reforms was the Decree Passive, which forbade the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. The church could no longer have its own military force. This decree was cleverly circumvented by later ecclesiarchs who refounded the Daughters of the Emperor as the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, arguing that the Decree Passive only prohibited men under arms, not women. But the spirit of the reform was clear. And never again should one individual be allowed to concentrate so much power within the Imperium's internal structures. And for the Inquisition, the Age of Apostasy was a humiliation. An organization that was supposed to protect the Imperium from internal threats had failed to prevent the single worst instance of internal corruption since the Horus heresy. The Inquisition's existing two ordos, the Malleus and the Xenos, were focused on external threats, demons and aliens. There had been no dedicated body within the Inquisition tasked specifically with monitoring the Imperium's own institutions, no specialized order of investigators whose job it was to ensure that the likes of Goj Vandir could never rise to power again. This failure led directly to the creation of the Third Great Ordo, the Ordo Hereticus. As known as the Witch Hunters, the Ordo Hereticus was established in the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy with a specific and terrifying mandate. Its members would focus on the enemy within. Their targets were not demons or aliens, but humans. Traitors, heretics, unsanctioned psychers, corrupt officials, rogue preachers, mutants, and anyone else who threatened the stability of the Imperium from within its own ranks. The Ordo Hereticus was to be the scourge of humanity's own worst impulses, the fire that burned away the rot from within. The Ordo Hereticus was given the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, as its chamber militant. This was a natural fit. The Sisters of Battle had been born from the same crisis that had necessitated the Ordo Hereticus's creation, and they shared a common purpose. But the sisters were fanatically devoted to the Emperor and utterly incorruptible in their faith. They were the perfect weapon for an organization whose job was to hunt human corruption, because they could be trusted never to be corrupted themselves. Their partnership was formalized at a gathering known as the Convocation of Nephilim, the details of which remain shrouded in mystery to this day. The creation of the Ordo Hereticus completed the triumvirate that would define the Inquisition for the rest of imperial history. 3 great ordos, each dedicated to combating one of the 3 categories of existential threat to the Imperium. The Ordo Malleus fought the threat beyond, the demonic forces of chaos that pressed against reality itself. The Ordo Xenos fought the threat without, the alien civilizations that sought to destroy or subjugate humanity. And the Ordo Hereticus fought the threat within, the corruption, heresy, and weakness that festered within the body of the Imperium itself. Together, these 3 Ordos Majoris formed the backbone of the Inquisition. But they were far from the only divisions within the organization. Over the millennia, numerous smaller orders, known collectively as the Ordos Minoris, would spring up to address more specialized threats. Some of these were significant organizations in their own right, while others were little more than cabals of a few inquisitors united by a shared interest. Some existed for centuries, while others appeared briefly and then vanished. The Ordo Sicarius, for example, was established to police the Officio Assassinorum, the Imperium's organization of elite killers, after the events of the Age of Apostasy revealed how easily such a powerful organization could be subverted by a corrupt leader. The Ordo Sepulturum was created to investigate and combat the zombie plague and other warp-spawned diseases that afflicted imperial worlds. The Ordo Chronos, most mysteriously of all, was formed to investigate the potential ramifications of time travel through the warp, and it eventually disappeared under circumstances so strange that their fate remains one of the Inquisition's most enduring mysteries. There was the Ordo Originatus, dedicated to unraveling 10 millennia of myths, exaggerations, and lies within the Imperium's historical records, and the Ordo Redactus, whose members worked in direct opposition to the Originatus by deliberately obscuring the imperial past to prevent dangerous knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. There was the Ordo Obsoletus, which investigated unexplained phenomena and supposed miracles, and the Ordo Militum, which monitored the Astra Militarum and other imperial military forces for signs of corruption or incompetence. The existence of these smaller orders is a reflection of the Inquisition's fundamental nature. It is an organization that adapts to the threats it faces, that creates new structures as new dangers emerge, and that allows individual inquisitors the freedom to focus their efforts where they believe they can do the most good. There is no central authority dictating what the Inquisition should investigate or how it should organize itself. Whilst the Ordos exist because individual inquisitors choose to associate with them, and they persist for as long as the threats they were created to combat remain relevant. This decentralized structure is both the Inquisition's greatest strength and its most significant weakness. It allows for incredible flexibility and adaptability, enabling the Inquisition to respond to new threats quickly and effectively. But it also means that there is no unified command, no standardized methodology, and no effective mechanism for resolving disputes between inquisitors who disagree about the best way to protect the Imperium. These disagreements, as we shall see, can have consequences that echo across centuries and affect the fates of entire worlds. But before we delve into the philosophical divisions that tear the Inquisition apart from within, let us first look at the military forces that give the Inquisition its teeth. Because for all the authority carried by the inquisitorial seal, there are times when subtlety fails, and the only answer is overwhelming force. And when that time comes, the Inquisition can call upon warriors who are among the most formidable in the entire galaxy. The Chambers Militant, warriors of the Ordos. Every Ordo of the Inquisition needs muscle. An Inquisitor can flash their rosette and command obedience from any Imperial citizen, can requisition troops and ships and resources with the stroke of a pen. But there are threats in the galaxy that cannot be subdued by political authority alone. Threats that require the application of sanctified violence in its most concentrated and devastating form. For these situations, on each of the three Ordos Majores maintains a special relationship with a dedicated military force known as a Chamber Militant. And these Chambers Militant are not ordinary soldiers. They are among the most elite, most specialized, and most feared warriors in the entire Imperium of man. Let us begin with the oldest and most secretive of them all, the Grey Knights. Chapter 6, 166, The Hammer of the Ordo Malleus. If you have spent any time at all in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, you have probably heard of the Grey Knights. But hearing about them and understanding what they truly are and what they represent are two very different things. The Grey Knights are, without exaggeration, the single most elite fighting force in the Imperium dedicated to a single purpose. That purpose is the destruction of demons. Every Grey Knight is a Space Marine, is a genetically enhanced superhuman warrior encased in power armor, trained from childhood in the arts of war. But unlike the warriors of other Space Marine chapters, every single Grey Knight is also a psyker, a being with the ability to channel the energies of the warp. This is extraordinary. In most Space Marine chapters, psykers are relatively rare, confined to the ranks of the librarians. In the Grey Knights, psychic ability is a basic requirement for entry. If you cannot wield the power of the warp, you cannot be a Grey Knight. Period. This universal psychic ability gives the Grey Knights capabilities that other Space Marines can only dream of. They can project psychic attacks that burn demonic flesh. They can erect psychic shields that ward off the corrupting influence of chaos. They can banish demons back to the warp with nothing more than the force of their will and the purity of their faith. Their weapons, forged from a rare psychically attuned alloy known as Nemesis Force, are devastating against demonic entities, channeling the wielder's psychic energy into blows that can unmake a demon's very essence. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Grey Knights is not their power, but their purity. In the 10,000 years since their founding, across countless battles against the most corrupting force in the universe, not a single Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos. Not one. Think about that. Entire Space Marine legions have turned traitor. Primarchs, the Emperor's own genetic sons, have been corrupted by the ruinous powers. But the Grey Knights have remained pure, while their souls untouched by the darkness they fight against every day of their existence. The reasons for this extraordinary record are a subject of much speculation. Some attribute it to the gene seed from which the Grey Knights are created, which is said to derive from the most pure genetic source imaginable, though the exact identity of that source is one of the chapter's most closely guarded secrets. Others point to the incredibly rigorous selection process that every Grey Knight candidate must undergo, a process so demanding that only a tiny fraction of candidates survive. Still others credit the chapter's culture of absolute devotion to duty and the constant psychic training that every Grey Knight undergoes throughout their career. Whatever the reason, the result is a fighting force that is uniquely suited to combating the demonic. When an Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus determines that a demonic threat has grown beyond the ability of ordinary forces to contain, they can request the deployment of the Grey Knights. And when the Grey Knights arrive on a battlefield, the demons know fear. The existence of the Grey Knights is one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. Most Imperial citizens have never heard of them. Even most Space Marines are unaware of their existence. When the Grey Knights fight alongside other Imperial forces, those forces are typically subjected to mind-wiping procedures afterward to ensure that the chapter's secret is maintained. Only the Inquisition and the highest echelons of Imperial leadership know the truth about Chapter 666. This secrecy is considered essential. If the general population of the Imperium were to learn that demons were real, that the forces of chaos were a tangible, physical threat that could manifest in the material universe, the resulting panic and despair could be more destructive than any demon invasion. The Grey Knights are based on Titan, that same moon of Saturn where Malcador hid the chapter's founders during the heresy. The Citadel of Titan, the chapter's fortress monastery, is kept as a private preserve of the Inquisition, inaccessible to unauthorized visitors. The chapter does not follow the organizational structure laid out in the Codex Astartes, the standard guide for Space Marine chapter organization. Instead, the Grey Knights have their own unique structure, reflecting their specialized mission and their intimate connection to the Ordo Malleus. Now let us turn to the second chamber militant, the Death Watch, the Long Vigil, the blade of the Ordo Xenos. If the Grey Knights are a chapter united by gene seed and purpose from their founding, the Death Watch is something entirely different. The Death Watch is a chapter composed entirely of veteran Space Marines drawn from chapters all across the Imperium. When a Space Marine is selected for service with the Death Watch, he leaves his chapter behind and travels to one of the Death Watch's watch fortresses, scattered strategically across the galaxy. There, he paints his armor black, retaining only his original chapter's insignia on his right shoulder pad as a reminder of where he came from. The left shoulder pad bears the silver icon of the Death Watch, and from that moment on, the warrior serves the Ordo Xenos. All this arrangement has profound implications. A Death Watch kill team, the basic tactical unit of the chapter, might include warriors from half a dozen different chapters, each bringing their own unique skills, traditions, and perspectives to the mission. A Space Wolf, wild and fierce, might fight alongside an Ultramarine, disciplined and tactical. A Dark Angel, secretive and brooding, might find himself working with a Blood Angel, noble and passionate. This diversity is not a weakness but a strength, because the Xenos threats the Death Watch faces are enormously varied, and having warriors with different approaches and specializations gives the kill team a flexibility that a homogeneous force would lack. The Death Watch specializes in studying alien species, learning their weaknesses, and developing tactics to exploit them. A Death Watch veteran might spend years studying the behavior patterns of tyrannid bioforms, learning to predict the movements of a hive fleet's advanced organisms, and identify the synapse creatures whose destruction will throw the swarm into disarray. Another might dedicate himself to understanding the technology of the Necrons, searching for vulnerabilities in their living metal and deciphering the alien logic of their phase-shifting defenses. Still another might focus on the Orcs, learning to read the signs of a gathering green tide and strike at the tribal leaders whose destruction will cause the Horde to fragment. When the Death Watch deploys, it is usually in small, elite kill teams rather than the massed formations favored by other Space Marine forces. These kill teams operate behind enemy lines, as carrying out surgical strikes against high-value targets, eliminating alien leaders, destroying critical infrastructure, and gathering intelligence that will be used to plan larger operations. They are the Imperium's scalpel, not its hammer, and their effectiveness depends on skill, knowledge, and precision rather than brute force. The Death Watch also has access to a wider range of equipment than most Space Marine forces, including, in some cases, alien technology itself. While the use of Xenos technology is technically heretical under Imperial doctrine, the Ordo Xenos recognizes that understanding the enemy sometimes requires using the enemy's own tools. A Death Watch warrior might carry a weapon reverse-engineered from Tau pulse technology, or employ tactics adapted from Eldari warfare. This pragmatic approach is a reflection of the Ordo Xenos itself, which tends to be the most open-minded and eclectic of the three Ordos Majoris. And finally, we come to the third chamber militant, the Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas, the burning sword of the Ordo Hereticus. The Sisters of Battle are not space marines. They are not genetically enhanced superhumans with centuries of life ahead of them. They are mortal women, human beings armed with faith and fury and power armor, and they are among the most terrifying warriors in the Imperium precisely because of their humanity, rather than in spite of it. The Sisters of Battle trace their origins to the daughters of the Emperor, the warrior women who served as Goj Vandira's bodyguards during the Age of Apostasy. When the daughters were shown the truth of Vandira's corruption by the Adeptus Custodes, they turned against their master and killed him, becoming instruments of his downfall rather than his protection. In the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy, the daughters were reformed into the Adepta Sororitas under the leadership of the newly appointed Ecclesiarch Sebastian Thor, becoming a military force dedicated to the service of the Imperial Church and, by extension, the Emperor himself. The relationship between the Sisters of Battle and the Ordo Hereticus was formalized at the convocation of Nephilim, and it is a relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than strict subordination. The Sisters are technically part of the Ecclesiarchy, not the Inquisition, and they answer to their own command structure. But when an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus calls upon the Sisters for aid, that call is almost always answered, because the Sisters and the Witch Hunters share a common enemy, the corruption and heresy that threatens the Imperium from within. What makes the Sisters of Battle so effective against the Imperium's internal enemies is not just their martial skill, which is considerable, but their absolute, unwavering faith. The Sisters believe in the Emperor with an intensity that borders on the superhuman. Their faith is not a passive thing, a quiet belief held in the privacy of their hearts. It is an active force, a burning conviction that manifests in battle cries that shake the walls, and in some cases, what appear to be genuine miracles. There are documented instances of Sisters of Battle shrugging off wounds that should have been fatal, of their weapons blazing with holy fire, of the very ground they stand on becoming sanctified against the touch of chaos. Whether these miracles are genuine manifestations of the Emperor's divine will or some form of collective psychic phenomena is a question that the Ordo Hereticus itself has debated for millennia. But whatever the explanation, the effect is undeniable. The Sisters of Battle are weapons of extraordinary power against the heretic and the witch, and their presence on a battlefield can turn the tide of a battle not just through their martial prowess, but through the effect their faith has on the morale of allies and enemies alike. Together, the Grey Knights, the Death Watch, and the Sisters of Battle represent the Inquisition's military might. They are the closed fist that backs up the Inquisitor's open hand, the weapons of last resort deployed when investigation and subtlety have failed, and only overwhelming force can save the day. But these chambers militant are only called upon in the most extreme circumstances, when the darkness has grown so deep that no amount of subtlety or cunning can cut through it, when the only language the enemy understands is the roar of bolter fire and the crash of powered blades. The relationship between an Ordo and its chamber militant is not one of strict subordination. The The Grey Knights have their own command structure, their own traditions, their own internal hierarchy, headed by their supreme Grand Master. The Death Watch answers to its own watch commanders. And the Sisters of Battle are technically part of the ecclesiarchy, answering to their own canonesses, and ultimately to the Abbess Sanctorum, who sits as a High Lord of Terror. When an Inquisitor calls upon these forces, they are requesting assistance, not giving orders in a strict military sense. In practice, the lines are more blurred than that. The Grey Knights have representatives who sit on the innermost councils of the Inquisition. The Death Watch maintains watch fortresses that are, in many cases, co-located with inquisitorial facilities. The relationship between the Ordo Hereticus and the Sisters of Battle is formalized by the ancient pact of the Convocation of Nephilim. But the principle of partnership, rather than subordination, is important, because it means that the Chamber's militant retain their independence and their integrity, as serving as allies rather than tools. This matters because an Inquisitor who could simply order Space Marines or Sisters of Battle to carry out any command without question would be a tyrant of unimaginable power. The independence of the Chamber's militant serves as a check, however imperfect, on the potential abuse of inquisitorial authority. An Inquisitor who makes unreasonable demands, or who clearly abuses their power, may find that their requests for military support are met with reluctance or delay. This dynamic creates a tension that is, in the Inquisition's own paradoxical way, healthy. It forces Inquisitors to justify their decisions, to make their case to warriors who are not obligated to agree, and to earn the respect and cooperation of their allies rather than simply demanding it. Beyond the Chamber's militant, some Inquisitors can also call upon a variety of other military forces. Inquisitorial stormtroopers, elite soldiers trained specifically for service with the Inquisition, provide a reliable and flexible combat force that is more readily available than the Chamber's militant. These stormtroopers are among the finest soldiers in the Imperium, equipped with superior weapons and armor, and trained to operate in the kinds of environments that Inquisitors typically find themselves in, from the cramped corridors of space hulks to the labyrinthine underhives of imperial worlds. Some regional inquisitorial conclaves even maintain their own dedicated Space Marine forces. The Storm Watchers, for example, serve the Caligari conclave, while the Red Hunters chapter has a particularly close relationship with the Inquisition as a whole, their warriors known for their unquestioning obedience to inquisitorial authority. And in times of extreme need, any Inquisitor has the authority to requisition forces from the Astra Militarum, from the Imperial Navy, from the Adeptus Mechanicus, or from any other branch of the Imperial military. The rosette opens all doors, and when an Inquisitor demands soldiers, ships, or weapons, the Imperium provides. But let us move from the grand scale to the personal. Because for all the armies and fleets and chapters that the Inquisition can call upon, the true work of the organization is done not by formations of soldiers, but by small groups of dedicated individuals working in the shadows. And at the center of each of those groups stands the Inquisitor and their retinue. Their retinues, the Inquisitor's life, authority, recruitment, and the retinue. What does it mean to be an Inquisitor? Not in the abstract sense of you have authority and you hunt bad guys, but in the practical, day-to-day reality of living as one of the most powerful and most isolated individuals in the Imperium of man. The answer to that question is more complicated and more human than you might expect. Let us start with how one becomes an Inquisitor, because it is not a straightforward process. There is no academy, no standardized training program, no entrance exam that aspiring Inquisitors can take. The Inquisition recruits through a system that is almost medieval in its structure. An existing Inquisitor identifies a promising individual, takes them on as an apprentice, and trains them over a period of years or decades until they are judged ready to carry the rosette on their own. Yet it is a master-apprentice system, personal, idiosyncratic, and entirely dependent on the judgment of the individual Inquisitor doing the recruiting. Potential Inquisitors can come from any background, Some are drawn from the Schola Progenium, the imperial institution that educates orphans of imperial servants, which produces many of the Imperium's most dedicated and capable individuals. Others might be soldiers who caught an inquisitor's eye through some act of exceptional courage or moral clarity. Still others might be scholars, psychers, nobles, or even former criminals who demonstrated the kind of determination and resourcefulness that the Inquisition values. What they all share, without exception, is strength of will. An inquisitor must be able to look upon the worst horrors the galaxy has to offer, demons, alien monstrosities, wipe the depths of human depravity and not break. They must be able to make impossible choices, to condemn the innocent alongside the guilty if the situation demands it, to sacrifice worlds for the greater good of the species. They must be capable of operating alone for years at a time, without support, without guidance, without anyone to tell them whether they are making the right decisions. And they must do all of this while maintaining their loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium, even as the things they witness try to erode that loyalty, one awful revelation at a time. The recruitment process typically begins when an inquisitor takes notice of a promising individual during the course of their work. Perhaps a soldier shows exceptional judgment during a chaos cult investigation. Perhaps a scholar demonstrates an uncanny ability to spot patterns in seemingly unrelated data. Perhaps a psyker displays unusual discipline and control over their powers. Whatever catches the inquisitor's attention, the individual is usually approached discreetly and offered a position in the inquisitor's retinue as an acolyte. Acolytes are the lowest rung on the inquisitorial ladder. They serve their master in whatever capacity is required, from combat support to data analysis to undercover infiltration. They are tested constantly, both by their master and by the situations they find themselves in, and those who prove their worth are gradually brought deeper into the inquisitor's confidence. Over time, a promising acolyte may be elevated to the rank of interrogator, which is essentially an inquisitor in training, a person who is being groomed for eventual promotion to full inquisitorial status. The jump from interrogator to full inquisitor is the most significant step in the entire process. When an inquisitor decides that their interrogator is ready, they recommend them to the orders of the Inquisition for advancement. Upon receiving the inquisitorial seal and rosette, the new inquisitor discovers that much of what they thought they knew was wrong. Secrets that their master had kept from them are revealed. Truths that had been hidden behind layers of deception are laid bare. This process of continual revelation is a deliberate feature of the Inquisition's training methodology. If a candidate cannot handle the shock of discovering that fundamental truths they had relied upon were actually lies, they are not strong enough to bear the burdens of full inquisitorial authority. Once elevated, a new inquisitor is, in theory, the equal of every other inquisitor in the organization. The Inquisition does not have a strict hierarchy, and every inquisitor is free to pursue their mission as they see fit. In practice, of course, experience, reputation, and political connections matter enormously. A newly minted inquisitor fresh from their master's tutelage will not carry the same weight as a Lord Inquisitor, with centuries of service and a network of contacts spanning half the galaxy. But the principle of equality is important because it ensures that even the most junior inquisitor has the authority to act decisively when the situation demands it. The Inquisition does have some titles and positions that reflect seniority and influence, though these are more like marks of honor than formal ranks in a military hierarchy. An Inquisitor, Lord, also known as a Lord Inquisitor or High Inquisitor, is an individual whose power, experience, and reputation have been formally recognized by their peers. Promotion to Lord Inquisitor is by invitation only, requiring nomination by an existing Lord and approval by two others. Beyond this, the titles of Master and Grandmaster are sometimes granted to the senior inquisitors of a subsector or sector conclave, respectively. And at the very top, there is the inquisitorial representative, the individual who serves as the Inquisition's voice on the Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of High Lords of Terra. But in the field, far from the political machinations of terror and the debates of the conclaves, The Inquisitor's most important resource is not their title or their authority. It is their retinue. An Inquisitor's retinue is their team, their family, their support structure, and, often, their only companions in a life of incredible isolation. Inquisitors typically travel with a group of hand-picked individuals who provide the skills and capabilities that the Inquisitor themselves may lack. A retinue might include warriors for combat support, psychers for psychic protection, scholars for research and analysis, tech adepts for interacting with Imperial technology, chirurgeons for medical support, and any number of other specialists depending on the Inquisitor's current mission and personal preferences. The composition of a retinue varies enormously from Inquisitor to Inquisitor. A militaristic Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus might travel with a squad of heavily armed warriors and a sanctioned psyker. A scholarly Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos might prefer a retinue of savants and linguists. A cunning Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus might rely on a network of spies and informants rather than a traditional retinue at all. Some Inquisitors keep small, tight-knit groups of trusted companions. Others maintain sprawling organizations with dozens of agents spread across multiple worlds, called upon as needed for specific missions. The members of an Inquisitor's retinue are drawn from every walk of Imperial life. Soldiers of the Astra Militarum, priests of the Ecclesiarchy, tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, sanctioned psychers, former criminals, alien mercenaries in rare cases, even space marines. The Inquisition's authority to recruit is as broad as its mandate to investigate, and an Inquisitor is limited only by their own judgment in choosing their companions. Some of the most interesting and memorable characters in the entire 40k universe are members of inquisitorial retinues. Elizabeth Bequin, the psychic null who served in Gregor Eisenhorn's retinue, and whose unique abilities helped found a new type of anti-psyker operative called the Distaff. Wistan Frauke, the untouchable, who served Gideon Ravenor with gruff loyalty despite his own isolation from humanity. Godwin Fischig, the Arbeits officer turned inquisitorial agent, who struggled to reconcile his sense of justice with the moral compromises demanded by the Inquisitor's life. These are people, not abstractions. They have hopes and fears, loyalties and resentments, personal histories that shape how they interact with their Inquisitor and with the threats they face. An Inquisitor and their retinue develop a bond that is unlike any other relationship in the Imperium. They fight together, suffer together, and face horrors that would break ordinary people. They share secrets that could get them all executed if revealed to the wrong ears. They depend on each other for survival in situations where the margin between success and catastrophic failure is measured in moments and millimeters. And sometimes they lose each other. Members of inquisitorial retinues die at an alarming rate, killed by the enemies they hunt or consumed by the darkness they investigate. The grief of losing a trusted companion is a familiar burden for every experienced inquisitor. And how they handle that grief says a great deal about the kind of person they have become. An inquisitor's authority extends far beyond their retinue, of course. They can commandeer ships, demand cooperation from any imperial institution, and call upon military forces ranging from Astra Militarum regiments to Space Marine chapters. They carry the inquisitorial rosette, that badge of office marked with the same stylized eye that Malcador the Sigillite used 10,000 years ago, and that rosette opens every door and silences every objection. When an inquisitor speaks, the Imperium listens, because to defy an inquisitor is to defy the Emperor himself. But the most powerful weapon an inquisitor carries is not their rosette, their bolt pistol, their force sword, or their psychic powers. It is their judgment. An inquisitor's greatest asset is their ability to assess a situation, to distinguish between a genuine threat and a false alarm, to decide when subtlety is called for and when overwhelming force is the only option, to determine who can be saved and who must be sacrificed. This judgment is what separates a good inquisitor from a bad one, and the consequences of getting it wrong can be measured in billions of lives. Which brings us, inevitably, to the great philosophical divide that runs through the heart of the Inquisition like a fault line through a continental plate. The question of how far is too far. The debate between Puritans and radicals. The philosophical divide, Puritans, radicals, and the soul of the Inquisition. If you were to gather 100 inquisitors in a room and ask them to define the greatest threat to the Imperium, you would get 100 different answers. Not because they disagree on the existence of the threats, but because they disagree on the nature of those threats, on the best methods of combating them, and, most fundamentally, on the moral limits of the weapons they are willing to employ. This disagreement is not a side issue or a minor quibble. It is the central tension of the Inquisition's existence, the question around which everything else revolves. The debate is often simplified into a binary between Puritans and radicals. And while this simplification has some utility, the reality is far more nuanced. The distinction between Puritan and radical is not absolute, but relative, formed entirely around the observer's subjective opinions. Few inquisitors consider themselves either Puritan or radical, as though they are swift to label others as such. An inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus might be quick to decry a colleague as a dangerous radical for using forbidden chaos law to bind a demon, while failing to recognize that others in the Ordo consider them equally dangerous for even daring to consult a tome of demonic knowledge, even though they have no intention of employing the information within. The line between acceptable practice and heretical overreach is drawn differently by every inquisitor, and there is no ultimate authority to adjudicate these disputes. That said, the broad categories are useful for understanding the philosophical landscape. On the Puritan side, you find inquisitors who believe that the threats to the Imperium must be combated using only sanctioned methods and approved doctrines. They adhere strictly to imperial law and tradition, viewing any deviation as a potential gateway to corruption. For a Puritan, the purity of the method is as important as the result. Using the weapons of the enemy, whether that means demonic artifacts, alien technology, or forbidden knowledge, is not just tactically unwise, but morally wrong, a corruption of the soul that will inevitably lead the user down the path to damnation. The most prominent Puritan faction is the Amalathians. The Amalathians are, in many ways, the establishment of the Inquisition. They are conservative in the best sense of the word, believing that the Emperor has a grand plan for humanity, and that the current structure of the Imperium, flawed as it may be, is the best available means of fulfilling that plan. Amalathians advocate for unity between imperial organizations and resist change for its own sake. They are the faction most likely to work within the system, to cooperate with other imperial institutions, and to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than force. The Amalathian philosophy was born at Mount Amalath, on the world of Gathalamor, where Lord Solar Macarius was inspired to launch his great crusade of reconquest in the early 41st millennium. At the extreme end of the Puritan spectrum are the Monodominants, one of the oldest inquisitorial factions, tracing their origins back to the 33rd millennium. Monodominants believe in the complete destruction of all non-human life and all deviants from the human baseline, including mutants and unsanctioned psychers. To a monodominant, the alien, the mutant, and the heretic are not merely threats to be managed, but abominations to be eradicated, root and branch, until nothing remains but pure humanity under the Emperor's rule. Monodominants are notorious for their excessive use of force and their willingness to accept staggering civilian casualties in pursuit of their goals. They are the inquisitors most likely to call down an exterminatus, the complete destruction of a world's biosphere, as a first response rather than a last resort. The irony of the monodominants is that their absolutist stance can itself become a threat to the Imperium. The Imperium depends on psychers for interstellar communication through astropaths and for faster-than-light navigation through navigators. Destroying all psychers, as the monodominant philosophy technically demands, would cripple the Imperium's ability to function as a civilization. This contradiction is one that most monodominants acknowledge quietly. accepting that the complete fulfillment of their vision is a distant goal rather than an immediate possibility. The Thorians occupy an interesting middle ground within the Puritan faction. Named after Sebastian Thor, the hero of the Age of Apostasy, the Thorians believe that the Emperor can and will be reincarnated into a new physical body, allowing him to walk among humanity once more and lead the Imperium into a new golden age. They believe that Thor himself may have carried a fragment of the Emperor's divine essence, and they search the galaxy for individuals who might serve as suitable vessels for the Emperor's rebirth. The Thorians are scholars and researchers at heart, are students of the human soul and its relationship to the warp, and their quest for the Emperor incarnate drives them to investigate phenomena that other Puritans might consider dangerously close to heresy. Now, on the other side of the divide, we find the radicals. These are inquisitors who believe that the ends justify the means, that the threats facing the Imperium are so vast and so terrible that no weapon should be left unused in the fight for survival. Radicals are willing to employ methods that Puritans consider heretical, from using alien technology to binding demons to wielding the very power of chaos against the servants of the dark gods. The most visible radical faction is the Xanthites, named after Inquisitor Lord Zaranchek Xanthus, who was executed as a heretic in the 32nd millennium. What the Xanthites advocate for the use of warp-based weaponry, including demon-possessed swords, demon hosts, and other artifacts of chaos. Their philosophy is brutally pragmatic. Chaos is the greatest threat to the Imperium. Chaos is also the most powerful force in the galaxy. Therefore, the only way to fight chaos effectively is to turn its own power against it. Using the enemy's weapons against them is not heresy, they argue. It is simply good strategy. The Xanthites are one of the oldest factions in the Inquisition, and despite the execution of their founder, they remain a significant force within the organization. Their members include some of the most experienced and successful demon hunters in the Imperium, individuals who have spent centuries learning to harness chaos energy without being consumed by it. Of course, the Puritans would argue that this is exactly the kind of arrogant self-assurance that leads to corruption, and the Inquisition's history is littered with examples of radical inquisitors who crossed the line from using chaos to serving it. An even more extreme radical faction is the Horusians, and their very name tells you how far they are willing to go. The Horusians look at Horus Lupercal, the War Master who nearly destroyed the Imperium, and they see not a cautionary tale, but a missed opportunity. They believe that the immense chaos power that was invested in Horus could, in theory, be harnessed and controlled, channeled into a new champion who would serve humanity rather than the dark gods. In essence, they want to create a second Horus, one who would serve as a divine avatar, and a being of godlike power dedicated to the Imperium's survival. Needless to say, even other radicals view the Horusians with deep suspicion. The idea of deliberately channeling chaos energy into a human vessel in the hope of creating a controlled superbeing is so dangerous, so profoundly reckless, that it makes ordinary Xanthism look tame by comparison. The Horusians are a small faction, and their activities are watched closely by both Puritan and radical inquisitors alike. The Recongregators are another significant radical faction, though their radicalism takes a very different form from the Xanthites and Horusians. The Recongregators believe that the Imperium, after 10 millennia of stagnation, has become decadent and corrupt, beyond the ability of incremental reform to fix. Their solution is radical not in the sense of using forbidden weapons, but in the political sense. They believe that the current structures of the Imperium must be torn down and rebuilt, that the only way to save civilization is to dismantle it first and reconstruct it in a form better suited to the challenges of the current age. This puts them in direct opposition to the Amalathians, and the rivalry between these two factions is one of the most enduring and bitter within the Inquisition. There are many other factions, some Puritan, some radical, some existing in the grey area between the two. The Animolian Beholders, who watch for signs of the Emperor's reincarnation. The oblationists, who believe that the truly righteous must damn themselves through the use of forbidden weapons in order to protect the innocent. The polypsychana, who view humanity's growing psychic evolution as a blessing to be nurtured rather than a threat to be contained. The xenos hybris, who believe that humanity can only survive by learning from and cooperating with alien species. Each of these factions represents a different answer to the fundamental question of how far the Imperium should go to ensure its survival, and each answer comes with its own set of risks and consequences. The key thing to understand about the Puritan radical divide is that it is not a simple matter of good versus evil. Puritans are not automatically righteous, and radicals are not automatically corrupt. There are Puritan inquisitors whose rigid adherence to doctrine leads them to commit atrocities that serve no practical purpose, destroying worlds and killing innocents for the sake of ideological purity. And there are radical inquisitors who use forbidden methods with careful restraint and genuine wisdom, accomplishing things that could not be achieved through conventional means. The tragedy of the Inquisition is that both sides have a point. The Puritans are right that using the weapons of the enemy is inherently dangerous, that the path from using chaos to fight chaos, to serving chaos while telling yourself you are fighting it, is shorter and easier than anyone wants to admit. The radicals are right that the threats facing the Imperium are so vast and so terrible that limiting yourself to approved methods is tantamount to suicide, that an Imperium too pure to fight dirty is an Imperium that will not survive. This tension is not resolvable. It is baked into the very nature of the Inquisition's mission. Yes, and the individuals who navigate it most successfully are not the ones who pick a side and cling to it dogmatically, but the ones who maintain their judgment, their humanity, and their commitment to the greater good, even as they walk the razor's edge between righteousness and damnation. Which brings us to some of those individuals. The famous inquisitors, whose names have become legend across the galaxy, whose stories illuminate both the heights and the depths of what it means to carry the inquisitorial seal. Legends of the Rosette. Famous inquisitors and their legacies. The history of the Inquisition is, ultimately, a history of individuals, not institutions, not policies, not grand strategies, but individual men and women who carried the rosette and used its authority to shape the fate of worlds. For some of these individuals are remembered as heroes, others are reviled as monsters. Many are both, because the Inquisition's work does not lend itself to clean moral categories. Let us begin with the most famous inquisitor of them all, Gregor Eisenhorn. If you know only one inquisitor's name, it is probably Eisenhorn's, and that is largely thanks to the brilliant series of novels written by Dan Abnett that follow his career across several centuries of service. But even within the lore itself, setting aside the novels, Eisenhorn is a figure of extraordinary significance, because his story encapsulates everything that is fascinating and terrifying about the Inquisition in a single human life. Eisenhorn began his career as a member of the Ordo Xenos, operating within the Scarus sector of the Segmentum Obscurus. He was a Puritan of the Amalathian faction, a man who believed in working within the system, in following established doctrine, in using sanctioned methods to combat the enemies of the Emperor. He was a competent fighter, a powerful psyker, a skilled investigator, and a man of rigid moral principles. In short, he was exactly the kind of inquisitor that the Puritans hold up as the ideal. And then the galaxy got to work on him. Over the course of his long career, Eisenhorn faced threats that tested every aspect of his character and his principles. His investigation of the heretic Pontius Glor and the forbidden text, known as the Necroteuch, exposed him to the temptations of forbidden knowledge. His battle against the renegade inquisitor Kixos forced him to confront the reality that the line between hunting demons and using demons was thinner than he had ever imagined. And the systematic destruction of his retinue and his life by the machinations of his enemies pushed him to a breaking point where the sanctioned methods he had relied upon were simply not sufficient to protect the people he cared about. Step by step, decision by decision, Eisenhorn slid from Puritanism toward radicalism. He began to use a demon host, a demon bound into a mortal body called Cherubiel, as a weapon against his enemies. He employed forbidden knowledge from the Necrotuque and the Malus Codicium to achieve results that conventional methods could not. He was declared a traitor by the Inquisition at least twice, and both times was eventually vindicated, but each vindication left him a little further from the man he had once been. Eisenhorn's story is a tragedy, but it is also a testament to the terrible demands of the Inquisitor's life. He did not turn to radical methods out of weakness or corruption. He turned to them because the enemies he faced were so powerful, so cunning, and so relentless that fighting them with one hand tied behind his back was simply not an option. Every step he took down the radical path was a response to a specific, concrete threat, a calculated decision to use a forbidden tool because the alternative was defeat and death. Whether those decisions were justified or whether they were the first steps on a road to damnation is a question that the law deliberately leaves unanswered. Eisenhorn's protege, Gideon Ravenor, is another fascinating figure. Ravenor was Eisenhorn's interrogator, a man of extraordinary psychic power and intellectual brilliance. During a great triumph on the world of Thracian Primaris, Ravenor was caught in an explosion caused by a crashing lightning fighter. The explosion left him blind, deaf, mute, and paralyzed, a mind trapped in a body that could no longer interact with the physical world. For most people, this would have been the end. For Ravenor, it was a transformation. Using his immense psychic abilities, Ravenor learned to perceive the world through other people's senses, to project his consciousness outward, and to interact with his environment through pure psychic force. He was encased in a specially designed force chair that contained life support systems and psychic amplifiers, and from within this chair, and he continued his career as an inquisitor. Ravenor's story is, in some ways, the opposite of his master's. Where Eisenhorn's career was defined by a gradual drift toward radicalism, Ravenor tried to resist that same drift, to learn from his master's example, and find a way to fight the enemies of the Imperium without losing himself in the process. Whether he succeeded is another question the law leaves open. Then there is Inquisitor Lord Fidus Cryptman, a figure who embodies the terrible calculus of the Inquisition's authority in its most extreme form. Cryptman was a member of the Ordo Xenos and the Imperium's foremost expert on the Tyrannid menace. He was the first Inquisitor to formally identify the Tyrannid threat to the galaxy, naming the alien species after the world of Tyran, whose destruction he investigated. Yet he warned the Ultramarines of the coming of Hive Fleet Behemoth, allowing them time to prepare the defenses that ultimately saved the world of Macragge. And he fought the Tyrannids across all three of the Great Tyrannic Wars. But it is Cryptman's actions during the Third Tyrannic War that made him both a hero and a pariah. Facing the advance of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a tendril of the Tyrannid superorganism that was devouring worlds and growing stronger with every conquest, Cryptman made a decision of unimaginable brutality. He established a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone of dead worlds intended to starve the Tyrannids of the biomass they needed to continue their advance. To create this buffer zone, Cryptman ordered the exterminatus of every world in the Hive Fleet's path, billions of Imperial citizens. Our loyal servants of the Emperor, who had done nothing wrong, were condemned to death by virus bomb and cyclonic torpedo to deny their biomass to the alien. It was the largest act of Imperial genocide since the Horus Heresy, and Cryptman had not finished. When the cordon proved insufficient to halt the Tyrannid advance, Cryptman devised an even more audacious plan. He captured a brood of genostealers, the advanced organisms that Tyrannid hive fleets used to infiltrate and weaken their prey worlds, and planted them in a space hulk that he then crashed into the territory of the Orc Empire of Octarius. The genostealer infestation attracted a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan into Orc space, diverting the aliens away from Imperial territory and toward a new prey. On one level, this was brilliant. Two of the Imperium's deadliest enemies, the Tyrannids and the Orcs, were now locked in a death struggle that would weaken both of them. On another level, it was catastrophically reckless, because the Tyranids get stronger by consuming biomass, and the orcs get bigger and more dangerous the more they fight. By pitting them against each other, Cryptman had created a crucible that would eventually produce the winner of an arms race between two of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Whoever emerged victorious from the Octarius War would be more powerful than either species had been going in. For his actions, Cryptman was stripped of his title and condemned by the Inquisition itself. A Carter extremis was issued against him, and he became a fugitive, hunted by the very organization he had served for over 2 centuries. Here, whether Cryptman was a hero who saved the Imperium through terrible but necessary measures, or a madman whose reckless decisions created problems worse than the ones they solved, is one of the great debates of inquisitorial history. And then there is Torquemada Coteas, perhaps the most dedicated member of the Ordo Malleus in living memory. Coteas is single-minded in his determination to eradicate the demonic threat, and he has built an extensive network of followers, informants, and agents that keeps him informed about everything happening in his sphere of influence. He is aging, his body failing, despite the best efforts of imperial medicine, and he lives with the growing fear that he will die before his work is complete. Coteas represents the Inquisitor as crusader, a man whose entire existence is defined by his mission, who has sacrificed everything, comfort, relationships, even his own health, in the service of a cause he knows he will never see fulfilled. Karamazov is another notable figure, though for rather different reasons. Fyodor Karamazov is a Lord Inquisitor who dispenses his judgments from a walking mechanical throne called the Throne of Judgment, a towering construct that contains servitors to record proceedings and carry out the inevitable sentence of guilt. For Karamazov, there is no defense and no mercy. Even the innocent are guilty of wasting his valuable time. He leads armies to descend upon worlds he finds wavering from the Emperor's path, and he is generally hated by both the ecclesiarchy and many of his fellow inquisitors for the excessive brutality of his methods. Karamazov is a Puritan taken to an extreme, yet a man so dedicated to rooting out corruption that he has become a form of corruption himself, a tyrant who uses the Emperor's name to justify cruelty that serves no purpose but his own satisfaction. High Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak is a more unusual figure entirely. A member of the Ordo Xenos, Chevak was already a controversial and respected inquisitor when he disappeared during an Archaeotech reclamation mission. He was missing for some 30 standard years, presumed dead. When he resurfaced, the truth of his absence was even stranger than anyone could have imagined. Chevak had spent much of the intervening time as a prisoner in the Black Library, the secret Eldari repository of chaos lore hidden within the webway. He had studied forbidden knowledge there, learned secrets that no human was meant to possess, and eventually escaped to become a freelance agent dedicated to thwarting the schemes of the chaos sorcerer Ahriman. Chevak is regarded by the Imperium as anything from a valuable but dangerous asset to a heretic deserving of summary execution, depending on who you ask. He represents the Inquisitor as explorer, a mind driven by curiosity into places where curiosity can be fatal. Each of these individuals represents a different facet of what it means to be an Inquisitor. Eisenhorn shows us the tragedy of the radical path. Ravenor shows us the struggle to resist it. Cryptman shows us the terrible cost of doing whatever it takes. Coteas shows us the crushing weight of duty. Karamazov shows us the danger of power without wisdom. And Chevak shows us the Inquisitor as a seeker of knowledge, him driven by the conviction that understanding the enemy is the key to defeating them. But all of them, every single one, shares one thing in common. They are alone. Not in the physical sense, because most of them have retinues and allies and contacts, but in the existential sense, the sense that ultimately the decisions they make are theirs alone, that the weight of worlds rests on their shoulders, and that there is no one above them to tell them whether they have chosen wisely or poorly. That loneliness is the Inquisitor's constant companion, and it shapes them as surely as their training, their philosophy, or their experiences. The tools of the trade: exterminatus, the black ships, and the weight of final judgment. We have talked about the Inquisition's authority in general terms, but there are specific powers and instruments that deserve their own examination because they represent the most visible expressions of the Inquisition's mandate and the most sobering reminders of what it means to wield the Emperor's authority in a galaxy of endless war. Let us start with one of the Inquisition's most regular duties, one that most Imperial citizens associate with the Inquisition, even if they know nothing else about the organization: the Black Ships. The Black Ships of the Inquisition are among the most feared vessels in the Imperial fleet. They are not warships in the traditional sense, though they are certainly armed well enough to defend themselves. Their purpose is far more unsettling. The Black Ships travel the galaxy on a never-ending circuit, visiting world after world to collect the tithes of psychers that every planet in the Imperium is required to provide. Psychers, individuals born with the ability to tap into the energies of the warp, are both the Imperium's greatest resource and its most dangerous liability. Sanctioned psychers serve essential roles throughout the Imperium. Astropaths provide the interstellar communication that holds the Imperium together. Navigators guide ships through the warp, enabling faster-than-light travel. Librarians serve as powerful weapons in the Space Marine chapters. Even the Emperor himself is sustained on the Golden Throne, partly through the psychic energy of psychers, who are sacrificed daily to fuel the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that makes warp navigation possible. But unsanctioned psychers, those who develop psychic abilities without the training and conditioning necessary to control them, are extraordinarily dangerous. An untrained psyker is a doorway to the warp, a crack in the barrier between reality and the realm of chaos. Through that crack, demons can pour into the material universe, possessing the psyker's body and using it as a vessel for unimaginable horror. A single unsanctioned psyker can cause a demonic incursion that kills thousands, and the Imperium has learned through bitter experience that the only way to prevent such catastrophes is to identify and collect psychers before their powers fully manifest. That is what the Black Ships do. They arrive at a world, and the planet's authorities deliver up those individuals who have been identified as psychers. The conditions aboard the Black Ships are grim. The psychers are kept in specialized cells, surrounded by wards and null fields designed to suppress their abilities. Many of them are terrified, ripped from their families and their lives, transported across the galaxy to an uncertain fate. Some will be tested, and if they prove strong enough and stable enough, trained as sanctioned psychers to serve the Imperium. Others will be deemed too weak or too unstable for training, and will be sacrificed to the Golden Throne, their psychic energy consumed to sustain the Astronomicon and keep the Emperor alive. The Black Ships are operated under the authority of the Inquisition, and they represent one of the organization's most fundamental responsibilities. Without the psyker tithe, the Imperium would collapse. Without the Astronomicon, ships could not navigate the warp. Without astropaths, interstellar communication would cease. The Black Ships ensure that the Imperium's most essential resource continues to flow, and the Ordo Hereticus in particular takes a close interest in their operations, since unsanctioned psychers fall squarely within their mandate as the enemy within. But the Black Ships are, in a sense, the Inquisition's routine work. The ultimate expression of its authority is something far more dramatic and far more terrible: exterminatus. The word itself is Latin, meaning extermination or annihilation, and in the context of the Imperium of man, it refers to the complete destruction of all life on a planet. The obliteration of an entire world's biosphere, every human, every animal, every plant, every bacterium, burned away until nothing remains but sterile rock and dead oceans. It is the most extreme measure in the Imperial arsenal, a weapon of absolute last resort that acknowledges not just the loss of a world, but the loss of everything that world contained: its history, its culture, its people, its potential. An Inquisitor has the authority to call down exterminatus. It is, perhaps, the single most terrifying aspect of their power. One individual, acting on their own judgment, can condemn billions of lives to oblivion. This is not a theoretical power. It has been exercised many times throughout imperial history, and it will be exercised again. The Inquisition considers it fully justified in circumstances where a world has been so thoroughly corrupted by chaos, or so completely infested by a xenos threat, that it cannot be saved by any other means. The methods of exterminatus vary, but they are all devastating. As virus bombs release engineered pathogens that consume all organic matter on a world's surface, reducing living things to a chemical sludge. Cyclonic torpedoes generate tectonic upheavals that tear a planet apart from within. Atmospheric incinerators ignite a world's atmosphere, creating a planet-wide firestorm that scours the surface clean. Each method is thorough, and each is irreversible. The decision to call exterminatus weighs on every Inquisitor who contemplates it. Most Inquisitors understand that this power exists for a reason, that there are situations where the destruction of a single world is preferable to allowing a threat to spread to neighboring systems and potentially consume an entire sector. But understanding this intellectually and actually giving the order are two very different things. Where many Inquisitors who have called exterminatus carry the weight of that decision for the rest of their lives, haunted by the knowledge that they condemned billions of people who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was living on a world that had the misfortune to attract the wrong kind of attention. Others have become desensitized to the act, treating it as just another tool in the inquisitorial toolkit, no different in kind from ordering the execution of a single heretic, merely different in scale. These Inquisitors are often among the most feared and most criticized members of the organization, because a person who can casually order the death of a world is a person whose judgment can no longer be entirely trusted. The Inquisition does maintain some oversight over the use of exterminatus, although the details of this oversight are deliberately vague. An ordo exists that is dedicated to reviewing exterminatus orders after the fact, and an Inquisitor who calls exterminatus without sufficient justification can face severe consequences from their peers. But sufficient justification is a subjective standard, and the practical difficulty of second-guessing an Inquisitor who was operating in the chaos and terror of an unfolding crisis means that accountability is, at best, imperfect. The existence of exterminatus raises profound questions about the nature of the Imperium and the values it claims to defend. The Inquisition maintains that the destruction of a world is sometimes necessary to protect the greater Imperium, that 1 billion innocent lives are an acceptable sacrifice if it prevents a threat from claiming 10 billion. This utilitarian calculus is the moral foundation of exterminatus, and it is one that many Inquisitors sincerely believe in. But there is a darker reading of exterminatus, one that sees it not as a necessary evil, but as the ultimate expression of the Imperium's willingness to treat its own citizens as expendable resources. In a civilization that calls itself the defender of humanity, the casual destruction of entire human populations reveals a disturbing truth about the gap between the Imperium's rhetoric and its reality. The Imperium claims to serve humanity, but it is willing to destroy any number of humans in service of its own survival. Whether this makes the Imperium no better than the enemies it fights is a question that the law raises, but never definitively answers. The Inquisition in the era. Indomitus. The galaxy of the 42nd Millennium is a very different place from the one the Inquisition was founded in. The Great Rift, a massive tear in the fabric of reality that stretches across the entire galaxy, has split the Imperium in two. On one side, Imperium Sanctus, the half that remains connected to Terra and the light of the Astronomicon. On the other, Imperium Nihilus, the dark half, cut off from the Emperor's beacon and beset by chaos, xenos, and every other threat that the darkness can produce. The return of Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected after 10,000 years in stasis, has brought both hope and upheaval to the Imperium. Guilliman has launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign to reclaim the world's loss to the forces of chaos and to reunify the scattered remnants of the Imperium. He has also begun a series of reforms aimed at addressing the Imperium's most glaring weaknesses, from the introduction of the Primaris Space Marines to the reorganization of imperial governance. The Inquisition has had a complicated relationship with these developments. On one hand, the return of a Primarch is something that many Inquisitors, particularly those of the Thorian persuasion, had long hoped for. A living Primarch walking among them is the closest thing to a divine avatar that the Imperium has seen since the Emperor himself walked the galaxy. On the other hand, Guilliman's reforms have disrupted the status quo in ways that many Inquisitors find deeply unsettling. Guilliman is a creature of logic and pragmatism, a being who values truth and efficiency over tradition and mysticism. He has little patience for the Imperium's culture of ignorance and superstition, and he has taken steps to uncover truths that the Inquisition has spent millennia trying to keep hidden. The establishment of the Logos Historica Verita, a body of historians trained by Guilliman himself to seek out the truth of humanity's history since the Horus Heresy, has put the Inquisition's Ordo Redactus in an uncomfortable position. The Redactus exists to obscure the imperial past, to redact dangerous knowledge from the historical record. Guilliman's historians are doing the exact opposite, and the tension between these competing objectives has created a new front in the Inquisition's internal conflicts. The Great Rift has also created new challenges for the Inquisition's mission. With half the galaxy cut off from the Astronomicon, communication and travel between the two halves of the Imperium have become enormously difficult. Inquisitors operating in Imperium Nihilus are effectively on their own, unable to call for reinforcements or coordinate with their colleagues in Imperium Sanctus. This isolation has forced many Inquisitors to become even more self-reliant than usual, making decisions of enormous consequence without any guidance or oversight. The Chaos Forces, empowered by the Great Rift, are more active and more dangerous than they have been in millennia. The Ordo Malleus and its Grey Knights are stretched thinner than ever before, fighting demonic incursions on 100 fronts simultaneously. The Ordo Xenos faces new threats from the Tyranids, the Necrons, and the ever-expanding Orc empires, as well as the aftermath of the Octarius War that Cryptman's Gambit set in motion. And the Ordo Hereticus confronts a rising tide of heresy and apostasy across a galaxy that is more frightened, more desperate, and more vulnerable to corruption than it has been since the Age of Apostasy. In this new era, the Inquisition's role is more important than ever. The threats facing the Imperium are greater and more varied than at any previous point in its history, and the organization's ability to adapt, to investigate, to act with the authority of the Emperor in defense of humanity may be the difference between survival and extinction. But the Inquisition's internal divisions are also more pronounced than ever, unexacerbated by the stress of operating in a galaxy that is literally falling apart. The debate between Puritans and radicals has taken on a new urgency because the stakes have never been higher and the consequences of choosing the wrong approach have never been more severe. What the future holds for the Inquisition is uncertain. It has endured for 10,000 years, surviving crises that would have destroyed any other organization. It has adapted to threats that its founders could never have imagined. It has produced heroes and monsters in roughly equal measure. And it continues to operate in the shadows, watching, investigating, judging, and, when necessary, destroying, all in the name of an emperor who can no longer speak for himself, but whose authority remains the bedrock upon which the entire organization rests. The Inquisition is not a force for good, not exactly. It is a force for survival. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, survival is the closest thing to good that anyone can hope for. Closing thoughts. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Inquisition. Though the subject itself is truly inexhaustible. We have traveled from the final, desperate hours of the Horus Heresy, where Malcador the Sigillite gathered his 12 chosen and set the wheels of history in motion, through 10,000 years of war, intrigue, and moral struggle. We have seen the Inquisition grow from a handful of agents operating in the shadows to one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy. We have watched it divide and evolve, creating the three great orders that continue to define its structure and its mission. We have met the warriors who serve as its muscle, the Grey Knights and the Death Watch and the Sisters of Battle, and the Inquisitors who carry its authority, from Eisenhorn's tragic slide into radicalism to Cryptman's terrible calculus of exterminatus. The Inquisition is, in many ways, a mirror of the Imperium itself. It is an organization that was created with noble intentions to protect humanity from the darkness that surrounds it on all sides. But over 10 millennia, those noble intentions have been warped and complicated by the realities of operating in a galaxy that does not reward idealism. The Inquisition has done terrible things in the name of its mission. It has destroyed worlds. It has condemned innocence. It has produced individuals whose methods are indistinguishable from those of the enemies they were created to fight. And yet, without the Inquisition, the Imperium would have fallen long ago. Without those solitary figures prowling the shadows, hunting the threats that no one else can see, the great machine of human civilization would have been consumed by the forces arrayed against it. The Inquisition is flawed, compromised, and often cruel, but it is also necessary. In a galaxy where the alternative to imperfect vigilance is complete annihilation, the Inquisition's existence is not just justified, but essential. The question of whether the Inquisition is ultimately a force for good is not one that the law answers definitively. It is a question that each Inquisitor must answer for themselves every time they draw their weapon, every time they sign a death warrant, every time they make the terrible choice between the lesser of two evils. And it is a question that we, as observers of this fictional universe, are invited to consider as well. What would we do if we were given unlimited authority and faced with unlimited threats? How far would we go to protect the people we love? Where would we draw the line? In the grim darkness of the far future, the Inquisition draws that line every single day, and every single day they get up and do it again. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Inquisition and the vast, sprawling lore of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, I would love it if you would hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. We cover all manner of topics from across the galaxy here on Q on 40k, and there is always more lore to explore, more stories to tell, and more dark corners of the Imperium to illuminate. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one, and until then, remember, the Emperor protects, but the Inquisition makes sure of it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.